Sephardi is any person who calls him or herself Sephardi for whatever reason, ethnic, linguistic, geographic, historical, emotional.
You will always find the Sephardim more lenient, more liberal, more forthcoming, less pressing than others.
It's something that's fluid, that's always evolving, that's developing, it's dynamic, and it's extraordinarily vibrant. And the people are equally vibrant and lively and warm and affectionate and open and proud.
It's a heritage, it's history, it's my father, it's my family, it's me, myself.
How do I tell the story of Sepharad? How do I unlock the secrets of a people displaced not once, but a dozen times from one end of the Mediterranean to the other? How do I trace the history of the Jews of Spain when there's scarcely a single indigenous Spanish Jew with a family tree longer than a couple of generations? I've heard the ancient Castilian tongue of Jewish Spain spoken, sung and chanted, but in Turkey and Bosnia, not in Spain. I've eaten spicy aubergines and pastries dripping with honey and cumin, prepared to ancient recipes, not in Andalusia, but in Hampstead and Haifa. Sometimes the story of Sepharad emerges in old prints and yellowing newspapers, wearing the traditional clothes of Sofia and Rhodes. From time to time, you can hear it in the florid melodies of Smyrna and Sarajevo. But mostly, it's clouded and obscure, a tale of perpetual displacement, of shifting traditions and changing shapes.
Noches, noches buenas noches.
Sepharad, the old Hebrew word for Spain, so I'm told, first mentioned in the book of Obadiah. But the prophet doesn't say where it is. According to some scholars, it could have been in Mesopotamia, Sardis, or Sparta. Not much help in my journey. So perhaps I should begin the story here in Tel Aviv. This is the Nahum Goldman Museum of the Jewish diaspora. It's a little shorter and more resonant in Hebrew. Bet Hatfutzot, the house of dispersal. Diaspora is a Greek word. Dia, about or round. Spirion, to scatter or to spread, like a farmer sowing seeds. And that building is dedicated to the memory of the widest and most fertile scattering in the history of the Western world. A scattering which started in Babylon and settled over most of Europe and half of Asia before the word was even coined. We're on the campus of Tel Aviv University. It's a rather scruffy seat of learning, with garish shopping malls sewn at random between streaked concrete blocks.
Can I see the baggage, please? Thank you very much.
There's also a security checkpoint. Well, we're used to that. But this one's manned by guards with Uzi automatic rifles and bulletproof vests. When you've got 3,000 years of history to look after, you can't be too careful.
Open the baggage, please. Thank you very much.
After that extravagant welcome, it's a positive relief to read the stone greetings over the entrance. Willkommen, Dobra Požalovec, Benvenidos. Well, you'd expect Willkommen for the German and Austrian Jews who escaped the Shoah. And these days, Dobra Požalovec is an equally predictable greeting for the Russians, who now make up more than 20% of Israel's population. But this is the one that haunts me. Benvenidos. For whom? Latin Americans, of course, who found their way to Argentina and Colombia and ended up in suburban villas next door to a scattering of their former Nazi persecutors. But Spain, when the history of the Jews of Spain and the lessons it has to teach us are the best-kept secret in European history. I have an American friend in Portugal, we'll meet him later on, who insists that in the USA, the story of Sepharad has slipped off the radar. That's why I'm here, to search below the radar for a hidden history. Let's go in. Could I have one ticket, please?
Okay. 20 shekel.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
What cultural treats are in the bookshop? Code word Viper. Israel in the Yom Kippur War. From the killing fields to Jerusalem. Well, I suppose that takes care of 1% of the story. But if we really want to follow the other 99% of the story, we must do so on foot, dispersed through the House of Dispersal. We'll have to take a route march up these steps and into the dark spaces beyond.
In this museum, actually, we're telling a story of life. It's dedicated to life. And here, actually, we can see how Jews were existing throughout history in dispersion and facing.
There are plenty of guides to make sure we don't lose our footing. This is Lali Haron.
As one unity, as one people without living on the same territory.
Now this is a familiar sight. A reproduction in high relief of the sack of the Second Temple in AD 70. Muscular soldiery bearing aloft a huge ritual candelabrum. Half a millennium after the Babylonian dispersal, the Romans completed the task. But up there on the wall is a legend in extruded concrete which tells us that this faithful copy is here for other purposes.
This is the story of a people which were scattered all over the world, yet remained a single family. A nation which was doomed to destruction, and yet out of the ruins arose to new life.
I see. This isn't the House of Dispersal at all. It's the Temple of Ingathering. Like the books on Israeli military history, these artifacts are here to teach us something. The historical necessity of the State of Israel, hence those words, a nation which was doomed to destruction. Wherever you travel in Mr. Goldman's concrete time machine, you're never far from the Holocaust. And we're only at the beginning of the tale. It's a little frustrating to have the denouement revealed halfway through Act 1.
The concept of remembering in Judaism is very central. And around this central place, we tell the story of life that we Jews cannot forget.
This is better. A series of meticulous models of the world's most celebrated synagogues. Here's the gleaming golden pagoda of the Kai Beng Fu in China. There's dispersal for you. And I can't resist the elaborate splendor of the synagogue in Curacao. But this one over here is new to me, and it's telling a totally different tale. A forest of slender columns, capped with Moorish decoration. No pews, no Ark of the Covenant. It's the Santa Maria de la Blanca in Toledo. Santa Maria? Moorish? What's a Catholic church in Islamic Mudéjar architectural style doing in a Jewish museum? And come to think of it, what am I doing here? A lapsed Ashkenazi Jew from the muddy marches of Belarus. We Ashkenazis originated in the German and Slavic worlds of Northern and Eastern Europe, light years away from the refulgent Mediterranean. The word itself, Ashkenaz, is the Hebrew for Germany, and their mother tongue was that form of bastard Low German known as Yiddish. Before I started this journey, I'd been in a Sephardic synagogue twice in my life, for a wedding and a bar mitzvah. So why am I haunted by this alien culture? Is it simply the seduction of the unfamiliar? Let's look at that model once more. Synagogue, transformed into a church and looking for all the world like a mosque. For a millennium and more, this was what it meant to be a Jew in the Mediterranean basin. living among the mathematical abstraction of Islam in Spain and Portugal and the Maghreb of North Africa, and then in the burnished certainty of the Ottoman Empire. A symbiosis between two faiths which lasted on and off for the best part of 900 years, and two faiths which today are at each other's throats. It's another story, a narrative of commercial confidence and diplomatic and medical skill. Everything comes back to Spain, to the slender white columns in the Santa Maria round the corner, a testament to 3 medieval centuries in which Jew and Muslim not only coexisted but enriched each other's lives and cultures. What was the secret of Sepharad?
I would mention 3 things.
Yitzhak Navon was once the president of Israel. Now he's the president of the Ladino Authority, dedicated to the preservation of the language and traditions of Sepharad.
1, synthesis, combination of faith and science. They felt there was no contradiction between being a rabbi and being an astronomer or a philosopher.
Professor Yom Tov Aziz comes from the former Ottoman world. He finds the secret of Sepharad in more practical matters.
Some of them showed great expertise in finance, in military affairs even, as well as in science and other fields.
The political commentator Meron Ben-Venisti is also of Balkan origin. He responds more to the social characteristics of Sepharad.
It wasn't only religion, it was tradition. It was a sense of belonging to a community.
Moderation in all matters, whether political or whether it is in religious matters.
They had a different concept of life, good living, which was, if you want, a rounded, simpler, if you want, approach to community affairs.
You can get rid of them easily without expecting any reaction. There would be no protest if you just dismiss a Jew from office. The political weakness is probably the secret of their political power.
But why is it a secret? Has the catastrophe of the last century thrown dust in our eyes? In this room, there's a series of video loops dedicated to lost communities. I remember these from my previous visit to the House of Dispersal. And there's one in particular, a memorial to the people of a city which wrote a huge chapter in the Sephardic story.
I might have been born in Salonika. This might have been my family.
Salonika. At the end of the 19th century, more than half the population of the city was Jewish, so Jewish that all work in one of the mightiest ports in the Ottoman Empire stopped on Saturday. The city was so prosperous and buoyant, it became known as the Jerusalem of the Balkans. If we want to know the secret of the symbiosis between Muslim and Jew, perhaps that's where our journey should really begin. I'm standing on a broad boulevard in Thessaloniki, and here, on the junction of Egnatia and Venizelos, I can see a faded reminder that this Greek city has a very Turkish past. Just to my right is the crumbling dome of an abandoned mosque. Now it's an equally abandoned cinema. It's covered in rusty scaffolding with trees growing up it. Equidistant on the other side of the street is a little hill of red-tiled Ottoman roofs, covering a former 16th century fabric market, which is now a rather shabby complex of flower shops and cheap fashion stores. Egnatia Street. It's a name that conjures up a past that's even older. Behind me, the city rises uphill in a terrace stacked with shops and cafes, and the air is perfumed with the dusky scent of strong Greek coffee and diesel fumes. These two Ottoman buildings have a tale to tell, but let's put them to one side for a moment. What preoccupies me is the name of this road. Egnatia. It's not Greek, it's Latin. Follow it to the right across Albania and the Adriatic, and you'll come to Ignazia in the heel of Italy. That's where two roads linked up. The Appian Way from Rome, which I travelled a couple of years back, and the Via Egnatia, which struck out across the Balkans and Asia Minor. But that's not all. This is a crossroads. 500 years ago, if you went north, you'd be in the Holy Roman Empire. If you went south across the sea down there, you'd hit the Muslim Maghreb. We're standing on the junction of two of the most ancient and mighty trade routes in the civilized world. No wonder that it attracted traders of every age, especially Jews.
Jews in diaspora never can say, this is my place.
Erika Pariah Zamur is in charge of one of Sephardic Salonika's most treasured places, the city's Jewish museum.
Here in Thessaloniki, we do believe this is our place. And we by no means feel stranger here.
The Turkish novelist Morris Fahy sees Salonika as the crucible of multiculturalism.
A global experiment of many peoples living in coexistence and living in very neighborly fashion. But you had to have an umbrella to enable that, and the umbrella was the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire gave all sorts of freedoms to all the peoples.
Salonika became the center because it was the only place where Jews were not a minority.
The historian Rena Molcho has devoted her life to excavating the secret of the city's vibrant tolerance.
Of the 200,000 Sephardic Jews of the Ottoman Empire, 80,000 lived in Salonika, and they represented 50 to 55% of the city's population. It is easy to understand why it was a Jewish capital and the capital of Sephardic Jews.
There were almost certainly Jews here in Alexander's day. We know they were here under Roman occupation because a fiery Jew announced the coming of the Messiah in the local synagogue. His name was Paul, and he preached in a form of Demotic Greek, which in later centuries became known as Romaniot. But down here in the side streets, where another Ottoman complex peeps out between the glass and concrete, we can see where the Jewish population of Salonika really took hold. These buildings were erected in the high season of Ottoman rule in the Balkans, after the conquest of 1430. Where the Ottoman Turks came, the Jews followed, and by now they weren't speaking Greek any longer. They were haggling and dealing in a version of Old Castilian Spanish called Ladino. Not Ladino now, of course, or Romaniot or Turkish. As I said, this Jewish, Turkish, Macedonian city was forcibly Hellenized after 1912. If you want to buy sea bass or halva or ouzo in this teeming market, you'd better brush up your Greek. But let's just slip out here into the road, past the stalls selling garishly coloured sweets and cheap aluminium cookware, and look back at the northern entrance of the market. Modiano. That's not a Greek name. It's Italo-Spanish Jewish. Modiano Market is at the heart of the old Sephardic quarter of Salonika. It's where Sephardic Jews settled after they were expelled from Spain at the end of the 15th century. And once in a while, you'll hear Spanish spoken here. Indeed, if you're lucky, you'll hear it sung. We're in the Salonika Jewish Community Centre. It's Friday night, the eve of Shabbat, and there are blessings and songs and dishes which blend all the flavours of the Mediterranean. And so do the songs they're singing. There are fragments of Hebrew and Turkish and Greek, but for the most part, they're singing in Ladino. Tomorrow is the festival of Passover, the annual commemoration of the biblical exodus of the Jewish people from Egypt. And the Sephardim of Salonika know what exodus means. Most of them arrived here in the Balkans in the years which followed the expulsion of the Jews from Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492. What does it take for a language and a culture to survive for half a millennium after it's uprooted? Come with me round the corner to the central synagogue and you'll understand. There were once 30 synagogues in Salonika, but most of them were gutted in the fire of 1917, and the Nazis put paid to the rest when they took over the whole of Greece from the Italians in 1943. The one surviving place of worship in the old Jewish quarter is located on the ground floor of a modern building, and it's a strange mix of the hieratic and the prefabricated. There's a traditional Ark of the Covenant, but there's little decoration. But what this place lacks in architectural distinction, it makes up in history. Look at these plaques on the wall. Toledo, Catalan, Lisboa, Girona. They record the separate Sephardic communities of Salonika and the moment of their arrival. The earliest goes back to the 1350s, nearly a century before the Turks arrived. But the greatest cluster is around the year 1492. 1492, the great catastrophe, an exodus to echo that of Moses and the children of Israel. But this wasn't 40 years in the wilderness. It was a 500-year odyssey, and it stretched across the entire Mediterranean and beyond. It took root in North Africa and the Near East. It crossed the oceans with the conquistadors and established itself in the Americas. But most of all, it was here, in the empire of the Ottoman Turks, that Sepharad had its second great flowering. Back in the community centre, with Greek Jews in a former Turkish dependency singing songs which evoke the maidens and troubadours of medieval Spain. What was it about Spain that exerted such a hypnotic pull, hundreds of years after the last of them were kicked out by Torquemada and the Inquisition? To find the answer, we must travel further. But don't worry, we'll return to the Jerusalem of the Balkans, all in good time. Just for now, though, we must go back beyond the fearsome edict issued by Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492, convert, depart, or die. We'll leave behind modern Greece and the Ottoman Sultanate which preceded it. But one thing will travel with us, a small book. You won't find it here in the Salonika Jewish community. The Jews are often called the people of the book, but it wasn't the Old Testament or the Talmud which secured their presence in medieval Spain as it did in the Ottoman Empire. The book that brought the Jews to Spain in the 10th century was the Quran. We're in Córdoba, in the center of Spain's southernmost province, Andalusia. I'm standing on a broad stone bridge spanning a wide grey-brown river. It's difficult to believe that this site transformed the known world. But this dingy river and the city that rises above it were the womb which gave birth to Sepharad. The river goes by the name of Guadalquivir. Guadalquivir isn't a Spanish name. It comes from the Arabic Wadi el-Kabir. This river was named by the Umayyad dynasty, who with their successors ruled Andalusia for more than 7 centuries. The Umayyads swept along the Maghreb of North Africa and across the Mediterranean at its narrowest point, bringing with them, among other things, Arabic, mathematics, astronomy, poetry, olive oil, almonds, and the Jews.
Hablo con coraje y sin espantar, que con una hija me quise bien amar.
We'll come to the Jews in a moment. Just for now, let's stick with the Umayyads. They transformed the rough kingdom of the Visigoths into a place of elegant Mudahar palaces, their patios lined with orange trees and softened by fountains. Being a desert people, they knew a thing or two about water. Wherever you go in Cordoba, or indeed the whole of Andalusia for that matter, you'll hear the discreet, reassuring sound of cascading water. It feeds the orange trees here in the Patio de Naranjas, the courtyard of oranges, in front of the Cordoba Mesquita. In the 9th century, it flowed into the basins which stretched in front of the grandest mosque in Christendom, so that the Muslim subjects, the Umayyads, could face their God, clean in body and spirit. And when they finally entered the great Cordoba Mosque, they saw one of the wonders of the Western world. Spain is crammed with buildings of astonishing beauty, but nothing stops the heart like your first sight of the interior of the Mesquita. 1,000 vaulted arches rising from slender columns, decorated with red and ochre stripes, all laid out with such grave mathematical symmetry that wherever you turn, at right angles or on the diagonal, another arched alley recedes into infinity. The capitals are delicately carved with stone flowers and lead the eye upwards to the richly coloured pine ceiling. Only here, by the mihrab, the focal point of every mosque, is the gaze arrested. In a small recess covered by a cupola in the shape of a shell, you can see the Arabic calligraphy which leads the mind to Mecca. It took a century to complete the Mesquita, but in those 100 years, something equally remarkable was planted here in Cordoba by the fertile Umayyads. We've left the mosque behind for the time being, though we shall return. Indeed, we've abandoned Cordoba altogether, and we're driving up into the hills which rise from the river plain. Because in the year 940, the Caliph Abd al-Rahman III decided to shift his entire court and a fair portion of the city to a commanding terraced location 8 kilometers from the Guadalquivir. It was a demonstration of his hegemony in Al-Andalus, his wealth and power, and the fact that it achieved dominion over the other warring Moorish families who tussled for control of the Iberian Peninsula. The huge and dignified court of the Caliph was known as Medina al-Tahara. There's a fanciful myth that he named it after his favourite courtesan. If the story's true, she must have been one of the grandest horizontals of the Middle Ages. It commands a sweeping panorama of the plain, and it occupies over 1 million square metres. A series of handsome palaces, linked by dignified arches embellished with calligraphy and floral tracery, are separated by gardens and floral avenues. All in ruins now, of course, shattered in the wars which followed the Caliph's death and the Christian reconquest which followed the wars. But in its heyday, Medina al-Tahara witnessed a restoration of culture, scholarship and jurisprudence which equaled the Renaissance, the Islamic Golden Age. When we link the words Golden Age and Spain, we imagine the empire founded by Ferdinand and Isabella and brought to its zenith by Charles V and Philip II. We think of those Habsburg monarchs with their ruffs and doublets and long chins and pendulous lower lips in the portraits of Velázquez. But we wouldn't if we were Muslims or Sephardic Jews. We're in the drawing room of Abd al-Rahman III. It's not quite what we'd call a drawing room, more an interconnected series of reception halls with exquisitely embellished pillars and richly stuccoed walls. It was here that courtiers and scholars debated philosophy and read elegant lyrics, when Spain was the throbbing intellectual heart of the Western world.
To a large extent, it's due to the Arab ruler Abdurrahman III.
Former Israeli President Yitzhak Navon ascribes the richness of Andalusian cultural life to this one ruler's influence.
Cordova was the capital, a very liberal, a very educated king. He was very open to sciences, to philosophy, to medicine, to astronomy, to other. And he called scholars and people of learning, of knowledge from all Muslim countries.
And where did the Jews fit in? Almost everywhere. There were substantial settlements here after the Roman capture of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple. But it was the Moorish invasion of Spain that set the seal on Sepharad. Because of their trading history, Jews were prodigious linguists, and to the Arabic-speaking conquerors, they were invaluable as translators. Their status as merchants in Byzantium made them the best Greek speakers in the Iberian Peninsula. Most of all, their history of persistent travel gave them access to knowledge from every culture in the Mediterranean basin, and this won them respect in Islamic circles. In the words of the traditional Arab proverb, in mobility, there is blessing.
There is no question about it.
Professor Yom Tov Aziz.
That the tiny Jewish community in various parts of the world, and particularly in Spain, contributed a lot to the transmission of the Greco-Arabic culture from the Muslim world to the Christendom, to the Christian, to Europe, and thus, in fact, contributing a lot to the scientific, philosophical, and technological revolution that will occur and make Europe dominant for the next 1,000 years and more.
We're in the gardens, which fall in graceful terraces below Abd-ar-Rahman's palace, and stretching to the horizon is the rich and fertile plain of the Guadalquivir. Al-Andalus gave birth to new methods of agriculture and hydroponics. Silks, cotton, flax and wool were woven here to the highest standards of luxury, and spices and exotic fruits were introduced from the east. Next time you cook with Spanish olive oil, or eat an almond tart, or peel an orange, remember how they first arrived on our shores, with the Moors and their Jewish trading partners. Food has always been the most effective point of entry to a vanished culture. It was certainly mine. My guide was the wonderful food writer Claudia Roden, whose book of Jewish food is an evocative Sephardic history in its own right.
They could travel in the Islamic world at the time, and they attracted a lot of people who came from everywhere. And so they brought all kinds of things from their past. But for instance, all the pastries in Spain have, one could say, an Arab influence, but it is the Jews who brought them. The dishes that are aubergine dishes are recognized as a Jewish input because aubergines were not used in the north. But even things like artichoke dishes. So in a way, they were the people who brought dishes that were maybe of Arab origin, but not quite Arab. They were Arab Jewish.
The ancient taste of Al-Andalus, as it might have tempted the courtiers of Medina Azahara. But meanwhile, the city on the banks of the Guadalquivir wasn't abandoned. On the contrary, it grew in prosperity in parallel with the court. Once again, Judaic and Islamic life developed a symbiosis. We're back round the corner from the Mesquita, in a small square with a warren of narrow streets leading off it. The Plaza Yehuda Levi. It takes its name from a distinguished leader of the Cordoba Jewish community. As a matter of fact, it only got its name back 100 years ago. Before that, it was named after one of Spain's several thousand saints. Let's just follow this little alley of whitewashed houses, trying not to be tempted by the tiled patios concealed behind the filigree iron gates and framed with oleanders, geraniums and bougainvillea. This street is called Judíos, and it's the carotid artery of Cordoba's former Sephardic community. The houses are all much later, of course. Nothing in this street is earlier than the 16th century, but they follow the same street plan and design as the Jewish quarter in Umayyad times. There's just one survivor from medieval Sepharad. This is the Cordoba synagogue, erected in the 14th century. It's been carefully restored in the Mudéjar style in which all of Spain's synagogues were built. There are plaster flowers and vines creeping along the walls, intermingling with Hebrew inscriptions. It's hard to imagine how the whole community could cram into this small square room on high holy days. But of course, there were no women here. They all crowded into the tiny gallery above us, carved in stone filigree. Scholarship, science, poetry and philosophy. It was too good to last. But before the high season of Sepharad was savagely challenged, there was one final flowering, and it happened here, just round the corner. In the 12th century, the rabbi of Cordoba had a son whose name would be linked with the city forever. If we take a few steps down the road, we can see his statue. A tall, seated figure with a spade beard and a turban, every inch the Arabic scholar, holding a book on his knee, his eyes cast thoughtfully downwards. Moses, the son of Rabbi Maimon, Maimonides, the great rationalist theologian, philosopher, doctor, Talmudic scholar, admired by the Catholic Thomas Aquinas and the Muslim Averroes. Maimonides personified the union of Greek, Islamic and Jewish thought which gave a gleam to the golden age of Andalusia. He was born in its final years, and in his youth these streets echoed with the sounds of passionate debate. If only there was somewhere in Cordoba today where his story could be told. But wait a minute. Hiding here in the brilliant white alleys of the old city is the Casa de la Memoria. Behind a blank wall opposite the synagogue is a complex of rooms dedicated to the life and culture of the Sephardis of Cordoba. A narrow corridor opens out into a patio graced by medieval stone arches, open to the blinding Andalusian sky, and paved in an intimate traditional design made up of pebbles. Leading off the patio are a series of rooms, a fully functioning kitchen for preparing Sephardic dishes, a room dedicated to the poetry and philosophy of the women of Andalusia's Jewish communities, a library of ancient first editions, and a roll call of every great Sephardic scholar from the times of Maimonides. Sebastián de la Obra is a civil servant and amateur cultural historian, and he's lovingly recreated this memorial to Cordoba's Sephardic legacy.
Here's a glazed cabinet in Oriental style, containing 70 books by Maimonides, by or about Maimonides, in Hebrew, Italian, Arabic, English, French, etc.
This isn't the place for a detailed exploration of Maimonides' contribution to European thought. However, there are three remarkable aspects to his work which tell us a great deal about the legacy of the high season of Sepharad. The first, and the most surprising, is that it was written at all. If he'd been born in the Kingdom of Poland or the Holy Roman Empire, Maimonides would have grown up in a culture marinated in dogma and mysticism. It was only the accident of growing up here in Al-Andalus that allowed him to inherit another tradition. Along with Islamic faith and Arab culture, the Umayyads brought with them Hellenic thought, rationalism. That's what grew in the diamond light of southern Spain. Greek thought in Arabic dress.
He speaks of the master, that is Aristotle.
Professor Yom Tov Aziz.
There is no question about it that he was the greatest Aristotelian philosopher of the Middle Ages. And he himself says that he agrees with Aristotle practically in everything except in 3 points. But nevertheless, there is no question about it that he was deeply influenced by Greek philosophy, and particularly of Aristotelian philosophy, and he received that Greek philosophy in an Arabic garb.
Equally remarkable was the vigor and diversity of his work. His guide for the perplexed is still prescribed reading for psychologists. And this wasn't just a theoretical journey through the human soul. Maimonides was a practicing physician. He wrote major treatises on drugs, sexual illness, women's medicine, and diet. To the end of his life, he'd devote 8 hours a day to his patients before settling down to record his theories and discoveries. To the end of his life, by rights it should have ended here in the liquid stillness of Cordoba. But by the time Maimonides reached the age of 13, this mosque was under the jurisdiction of a very different dynasty from the dignified, rational Umayyads. The aggressive Shiite Berber tribe known as the Almohads swept down from the Atlas Mountains across the neck of the Mediterranean and conquered Andalusia. They drove out the Jews and established their hegemony throughout the south. Rabbi Maimon and his son fled to Almeria, but the Almohads soon gained a foothold there, and Maimonides set off on his travels once again, this time to Fez in Morocco. We'll leave his story there for the time being, although we may catch up with him later. The story of this mosque, though, demands a further chapter. The Almohad dominion lasted 90 years. These were harsh times for the Jews of Andalusia, and they drifted south and east like Rabbi Maimon's family, or northwards into reconquered Catholic Spain. Yes, it was a better bet to risk the might of the resurgent Christian kings than the savagery of the Almohads. And resurgent Catholicism wrote the final pages in the tale of this ravishing building. Let's just walk once again between these dreaming rows of high arches. Wait a minute. As we turn towards the mihrab, at an angle of 45 degrees, a weighty Gothic structure suddenly bars our way. Thrust across this solemn mathematical space, there are columns and finials and capitals and rows of pews and an organ. In the middle of the mesquita, we're sucked into Cordoba Cathedral. I'll never forget my first sight of this building. It was like an act of architectural rape. To be sure, it didn't happen overnight. For decades, the priests bivouacked here between the arches. But they finally pulled down hundreds of Abderrahman's noble columns and replaced them with fan vaulting and choir stalls and a high altar. When he finally saw their work, King Charles said, "If I'd known, I would not have allowed you to destroy it. What you've done could have been done in other places. You have destroyed what was unique in the world." But not quite. The architecture may have been violated, but the spirit lived on elsewhere. Travel with me to the ancient capital of Castile, to the city of Toledo.
En la ciudad de Toledo, en la ciudad de Granada.
In Mobility There Is Blessing was written and presented by Dennis Marks, with technical presentation by Tim Alcock, Eugenia Santiago and Tony Wass. The Search for Sepharad was a director's cut production for BBC Radio 3.